Those of you who grew up playing Battlefront 2 will surely remember the TX-130 fighter tank, one of the Republic's most versatile armored units. In Battlefront, the TX-130 essentially served as the Republic equivalent to the Separatist armored assault tank. In a recent video, we called the AAT one of the best repulsor lift tanks in galactic history, so what about the TX-130? Does it rank up near the AAT? Was it really as good as we remember it being from Battlefront, or was the game's portrayal inaccurate? We're going to be answering all these questions today as we take a look at the tank in detail. The TX-130 Saber-class fighter tank was a product of Rothana Heavy Engineering made for the Grand Army of the Republic at the request of the Kaminoans. It was designed to be used by Jedi generals as a sort of command tank, much as Separatist commanders tended to use the AAT, and as a result, it was initially produced in fairly small numbers. After the tank proved itself extremely effective at the start of the Clone Wars, however, production of the TX-130 was dramatically ramped up and it started seeing use in more diverse roles on battlefields across the galaxy. The TX-130 was actually quite small. In fact, it was so small that it wasn't even classified as a tank, but rather as a speeder. Its branding as a fighter tank, however, was a much more accurate labeling of its role. Essentially, the tank was designed to be the Jedi starfighter of the ground, a fast, maneuverable craft that could nonetheless hit hard and serve as a versatile command post. The engineers at Rothana really just wanted everything you could possibly want in a military vehicle crammed into one package, and somehow they managed to pull it off. Rothana ended up designing one of the most insanely compact speeder tanks in galactic history. Held aloft by a comprehensive network of repulsor lifts, the TX-130 was fast, with a top speed of 320 kilometers per hour. For a repulsor lift tank, that's absolutely incredible. To contrast, the AAT had a top speed of only 55 kilometers per hour, and the ground armored tank, the Confederacy's equivalent to the TX-130, could only reach 130 kilometers per hour. As far as speed and maneuverability were concerned, this tank really was just a starfighter that couldn't fly all that high. Accordingly, the TX-130 featured a very flat design intended to be as aerodynamic as possible. The tank's cabin was located at the back so that the armored frame of the craft could slope up to its height gently, for example. Speaking of the cabin, it was rather cramped. It was barely high enough for clones to be able to stand upright in. However, it nonetheless managed to have room for the tank's pilot, a co-pilot, a gunner, 2 passengers, and even an astromech, though all of them at once would have been a hell of a tight squeeze. This cabin was accessible via a large door at the back of the tank. 2 clone pilots operated the TX-130, one that served as the primary pilot and another who served as the co-pilot and navigator. The tank featured a pair of small windows for these pilots to make use of in the event that the tank's instruments were ever damaged, which could be sealed up with armored plates to prevent enemy snipers from taking advantage of them. Additionally, the tank also had a position for a gunner, who could use a hatch on the top of the craft to access a small dorsal turret. Not all TX-130s employed gunners, however, and some didn't even bother with co-pilots either. For example, Jedi who piloted these tanks on the battlefield usually did so alone. The realities of making such a compact vehicle with such a high speed meant that the TX-130 was rather lightly armored. This was likely another factor in its formal classification as a speeder rather than a tank. Its armor was light enough that any real tank would probably be able to blow the TX-130 away with a single shot, especially if it aimed for the cabin door at the back of the craft, a notable weak point. To account for this, the engineers at Rothana actually managed to work a pair of onboard Exoshell 3 deflector shield projectors into the craft's design. These shield generators allowed the TX-130 to soak up a lot more damage than its armor could alone, and this, in turn, allowed the craft to go toe-to-toe with real tanks on the battlefield. Of course, this only worked to a degree. Even with the shields, the TX-130 was still quite fragile for a tank and couldn't count on being able to soak up too much damage. The TX-130's main weapons were a pair of heavy laser cannons which were mounted on outrigger arms on either side of the craft. These cannons weren't fixed and could turn on both the vertical and horizontal axes, though only to a degree. They had a high rate of fire and a respectable damage output. They weren't nearly as powerful as the main cannon of the AAT, but they could nonetheless do plenty of damage in their own right due to their high rate of fire. The TX-130 took only a few shots to destroy the average light armored vehicle, and it could deliver those shots in the same amount of time the AAT took to fire off just one round from its primary cannon. Additionally, most TX-130 models had some sort of dorsal turret. The stock model featured twin medium laser cannons, while other TX-130 variants featured powerful beam cannon turrets. Both were intended for anti-personnel use, and both were effective enough at that role. The TX-130 also featured a pair of onboard missile launchers, which were variable payload and could carry 10 rockets each. This was quite the ordnance load for such a small tank, and it gave the TX-130 incredible destructive potential. With the right rockets, these fighter tanks could take down much larger targets with ease, all while moving at almost unfairly fast speeds. All told, the TX-130 fighter tank was a hell of a war machine, and we can only assume that it was approximately expensive as a result. It's no small wonder that it was initially produced in such small lines then. But the Republic clearly found the credits to buy a whole lot of them anyway, and we can't say we blame them. These tanks were positively insane, and while we'd still say that the armored assault tank was overall a better repulsor tank, this craft is definitely up there in the rankings. While it may not have been exactly what we remember from Battlefront, it was nonetheless about as good. As with many other GAR vehicles, the TX-130 made its battlefield debut in the First Battle of Geonosis. Jedi generals made use of the tanks as personal command vehicles during the opening and closing stages of the battle, with Mace Windu and Luminara Unduli being the most notable TX-130 pilots on Geonosis. Shortly before the assault on the Petronaki Arena at the start of the battle, they leaped into the cockpits of the TX-130s to rapidly neutralize anti-aircraft guns, allowing the Republic assault ships to descend into the lower atmosphere. As the battle came to a close, Windu once more hopped into a TX-130 to pursue Count Dooku, though he was prevented from catching up with the Count by a trio of Dark Acolytes. The most notable use of the TX-130 was during the Dark Reaper crisis in the first months of the Clone Wars. In that campaign, fighter tanks began to see use by clone crews as well as by Jedi, and they proved to be excellent anti-armor units. On Raxus Prime, Renvar, and Thul, TX-130 tanks proved to be the Republic's saving grace, ultimately allowing the GAR to stop Count Dooku's Dark Reaper before he unleashed it on the galaxy. As we mentioned in a recent video on that superweapon, the TX-130 was especially crucial for Republic forces in the Battle of Thul. The Dark Reaper itself was ultimately destroyed by a TX-130 piloted by Anakin Skywalker. After the Dark Reaper crisis, the TX-130 became one of the Grand Army's more common ground vehicles. It wasn't quite as common as the AT-TE or AT-RT, likely due to the cost or manufacturing issues, but it did see its fair share of use, especially during the Outer Rim sieges. The sieges saw the TX-130's anti-armor capabilities employed to their fullest, as Jedi generals routinely sent squadrons of fighter tanks out to clear away separatist tank columns. TX-130s notably participated in the grueling siege of Seleucami. All told, the TX-130 fighter tank was a beast of a war machine. It may not have been as resilient as most tanks or as heavy-hitting as some of its counterparts, but it wasn't really supposed to be. It was, after all, a fighter tank, focused more on speed than armor, and in that category it excelled. No other tank in the entire Star Wars universe was even remotely as fast as the TX-130. And it still packed enough of a punch to blow the likes of the GAT and AAT away on most battlefields. This war machine really was the Jedi Starfighter of the ground, and the engineers at Rothana who designed it were absolute geniuses. The Republic's Starfighter Corps seemingly couldn't make up its mind on what Starfighter model to use during the Clone Wars. It adopted and dropped numerous fighter classes over the course of the war, to the point where only the LAAT/I Gunship remained in service consistently for the entire conflict. In particular, the Corps was seemingly indecisive about what model fighter to use as its primary interceptor class. At the start of the war, the Delta 7 starfighters favored by the Jedi were adopted for general use, only to be replaced by the V-19 Torrent, which in turn was replaced by the Z-95 Headhunter. If you're a regular on this channel, you're probably quite familiar with all of these craft, which appeared prominently in Star Wars: The Clone Wars. But you're probably less familiar with the Z-95's replacement, the interceptor the Republic finally settled on at the end of the war, the V-Wing Starfighter. As we've mentioned in earlier videos, the Republic was always at a heavy disadvantage when it came to starfighter combat. The Confederacy's droid starfighters were simply better than any organic pilots who weren't Anakin Skywalker or Saesee Tiin, as they were capable of executing breakneck maneuvers that would splatter organic pilots against their cockpit chairs. Worse, they always outnumbered clone pilots. Vulture droids, the Confederacy's primary starfighters, were usually deployed in swarms of over 1,000, while even elite models like the Tri-Fighter were deployed in the hundreds in most battles. The Republic couldn't match or even effectively counter those numbers, they just didn't have enough pilots. The best thing the Republic could do was try to get the best interceptors possible, which would enable outnumbered clone pilots to fight effectively against larger swarms of faster fighters. The Republic contracted Slane and Corporal to build their dream interceptor, and the Verpine company ended up producing the V-19 Torrent. The V-19 quickly replaced the Delta 7 craft that had been deployed as a placeholder beforehand, and it proved effective against the Confederacy's Vulture droids. But it wasn't effective enough, and when the CIS unleashed its new Tri-Fighters midway through the war, the V-19s became easy prey for those fiercely intelligent craft. As a result, the V-19 was sidelined in favor of the Z-95 Headhunter, but that craft fared little better against the deadly Tri-Fighters. The Republic turned to Kuat Systems Engineering next, and they ultimately produced the Alpha 3 Nimbus-class V-Wing Starfighter. Designed by Wilex Blissex, who would later go on to design the Rebel Alliance's A-Wing Starfighter, the V-Wing was loosely based on the Delta 7, which Blissex had also designed previously. But the V-Wing was a huge improvement over its predecessor. It was faster, more maneuverable, more heavily armed, and overall more effective than any interceptor the Republic had ever fielded before. The V-Wing was a very compact and bare-bones craft. It featured no hyperdrive or life support systems, and it could only carry a single clone pilot and an astromech. What's more, due to the compact nature of the fighter, Kuat had to work with Industrial Automaton to produce a new, more compact astromech droid specifically for use with the V-Wing, as conventional models were simply too big to fit. The resultant droids, the Q7 series astromechs, were spherical and floated around on repulsor lifts when not hooked into their ships. Like many of the craft the Republic developed at the end of the Clone Wars, the V-Wing incorporated S-foils, which were deployable flaps that radiated excess heat. Two such panels made up each of the craft's wings, giving it its nickname, while another two at the rear of the craft served as deflector shield heat sinks. These S-foils doubled as landing gear, further streamlining the V-Wing design. The V-Wing's laser cannons were located at the point where these wings connected with the main body of the craft. These guns weren't the most powerful ever featured on a starfighter, but they did their job well enough, as they had a high rate of fire and could effectively track and destroy Vulture droids. But the most important feature of the V-Wing was its ion drive engines. Predecessors to the infamous twin ion engine system used by the Empire, these powerful propulsion systems allowed V-Wings to fly at speeds of up to 4,800 times the force of gravity in a vacuum. Truly frightening speeds that not even Tri-Fighters were capable of matching. V-Wings featured heavy-duty inertial dampeners so that pilots could actually survive flying at these speeds, which gave the craft the additional advantage of being able to execute breakneck turns more safely than other interceptors of the day. This allowed the V-Wing to fight separatist craft like the Vulture droid and Tri-Fighter on more even terms, an absolutely crucial breakthrough for the Republic. Additionally, the V-Wing was fairly low maintenance, and it only required one clone pilot. V-Wing pilots wore specialized spacesuits that differed slightly from the suits worn by other clone pilots, as they were pressurized and featured fully enclosed helmets to make up for the craft's lack of life support. These last two features meant that V-Wings could not only be mass-produced in great numbers, but also be deployed in great numbers. The V-Wing first saw deployment at the start of 19 BBY, the last year of the Clone Wars. At first, it was integrated into the RSC in small numbers, as the Republic wanted to be sure of the model before beginning mass production. When the V-Wing proved itself to be incredibly effective, it was rushed into production and older interceptor models were quickly phased out in favor of V-Wings. The hangars of Venator-class Star Destroyers were rapidly updated to be able to accommodate the new interceptors. And within weeks of the V-Wings premiere, virtually every Venator in the Republic Navy carried a swarm of them. Republic Star Destroyers could carry up to 192 V-Wings in their cavernous main hangars, and by the end of the Clone Wars, Star Destroyer captains had begun to rely heavily on the agile craft, despite only having them for a few months. Since V-Wings could be deployed quickly and in vast numbers, Republic naval officers began deploying them as soon as their Star Destroyers came out of hyperspace, allowing them to form a defensive screen around the main hangar before Separatist fighters could gather for an attack. Once all fighters were deployed, the V-Wings would then use the Confederacy's own swarm tactics against them, giving those pesky droid fighters a taste of their own medicine. As an interceptor, the V-Wing's primary combat role was to destroy other starfighters, and it excelled at that job. It could outmaneuver even Tri-Fighters and Vulture droids, and it was usually deployed in large enough numbers that the Confederacy's swarm tactics were ineffective against it. It served well in a number of other roles as well. V-Wings were frequently deployed as fighter escorts for shuttles or other important craft, and they were also used heavily for planetary defense. Whenever the Separatists managed to break through Republic lines during the Outer Rim sieges, they were sure to encounter swarms of V-Wings on the other side, which, more often than not, were able to turn aside Separatist raids and surgical strikes. The only thing the nimble craft weren't good at was long-range reconnaissance, as V-Wings required hyperdrive rings and had a maximum range of 10 hyperspace jumps. However, the Republic had the ARC 170 to fill that role, so that small failing ultimately didn't really matter. The V-Wing was a Separatist naval officer's worst nightmare. They took everything that made the Confederacy all but unbearable in starfighter engagements and made it all work for the Republic. The superior skill of clone pilots meant that whenever swarms of V-Wings went up against swarms of droid fighters, the clones came out on top more often than not, completely eliminating one of the Confederacy's few remaining advantages. We have no doubt that the V-Wing played a significant role in the Republic's victories in the Outer Rim sieges. V-Wing starfighters served primarily in the last few months of the Outer Rim sieges and the first few months of the Imperial era. This is why we don't see them at all in Star Wars: The Clone Wars. The show almost entirely takes place before then, after all. They fought in many battles during the Outer Rim sieges, with the most notable being the Battle of Coruscant. On Coruscant, swarms of V-Wings defended Galactic City against General Grievous's Vulture droids in the initial stage of the battle, shooting them down before they could complete suicide runs on skyscrapers. When Separatist forces fled to orbit at the end of the battle, the V-Wings pursued them, and untold thousands of them fought in the last great naval battle of the Clone Wars. As we just mentioned, V-Wings were used by the Empire during its early years as well, before they were replaced by CNF Fleet Systems TIE Fighter. The V-Wing faded into relative obscurity after that, but its impact remained. Indeed, the TIE Fighter was largely a spiritual descendant of the V-Wing, as it was designed to use the same swarm tactics that had made the V-Wing so effective. The V-Wing also inspired one of the Rebel Alliance's favoured starfighters, the A-Wing, which was also a compact, high-speed interceptor. So that's the story of the V-Wing, which is probably the most underrated ship in the history of science fiction, if you ask us. Star Wars has more than its fair share of iconic warships, and the Galactic Republic in particular has several associated with it. But most of these vessels were Clone Wars era ships, meaning that while they were certainly iconic and played an important role, they only served the Republic for 3 years. The vessel we're going to be talking about today served the Republic for over 3,000 years, and it was in no small part responsible for saving the Republic several times over. This vessel is the Hammerhead class cruiser, and in this video, we're going to be giving it the recognition it deserves. The Hammerhead class cruiser was a product of Rendili Hyperworks, one of the core world's finest shipbuilding firms. At roughly 315 meters long, it was much smaller than most Clone Wars era warships, but it was a respectable size for its time. Aside from its large, distinctive forward section, it was a rather slim vessel, but for its size, it packed quite a bit of firepower and had plenty of interior space. A crew of 300 was required to operate the vessel, or one Sith Lord as Darth Sion demonstrated, and it could carry up to 400 passengers, plus 4,000 tons of cargo, 2 shuttles, and a wing of 12 Auric-class tactical strike fighters. In terms of weaponry, the Hammerhead featured 2 medium dual turbo laser batteries, 4 light turbo laser batteries, a tractor beam array, and a comprehensive system of point defense laser cannons. The turbo lasers were mostly clustered on the large head of the warship, while the point defense cannons ran in strips along the sides of the vessel. The Hammerhead could take quite a bit of punishment, and it could give as good as it got too. The cruisers featured powerful engines and shields, both of which were hallmarks of Rendili design, and if either failed, they also featured several layers of armor plating, which was designed to prevent catastrophic hull breaches. They were incredibly durable vessels, and they could take lengthy barrages with shields down and manage to avoid major hull breaches. One ship, the Endar Spire, was able to take a pummeling from a Sith fleet without any of its major compartments being breached, right up to the point where it was vaporized. The ship was designed so that if a vessel was damaged beyond repair, the interior would remain functionally intact for as long as possible to allow the crew to escape. While the weapons array for these ships might not seem like much, they packed quite a punch. The primary weapons of Hammerhead-class cruisers were a mix of light and medium turbo lasers, and while these weren't as powerful as heavier models, they were capable of firing much faster. If all of the forward guns on a Hammerhead were trained on the same target, they could deal as much damage as an array of heavy turbo lasers, and they were still capable of a greater degree of precision as well. The point defense systems on these vessels left the Hammerheads with no major blind spots, though sufficiently large swarms of starfighters could easily overwhelm them. The Hammerhead was designed around 4,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, and a handful of experimental models saw use in the Great Sith War, particularly during the Battle of Koros Major. They proved wildly successful, and as the Republic completely overhauled its military in the wake of the conflict, the Hammerhead became one of the primary vessels of the Republic Navy. So many were ordered by the Republic that it was estimated over the course of decades, Rendili put out a new one every 10 days. As the Mandalorians, under the rule of Mandalore the Ultimate, set their sights on the Republic stepped up its shipbuilding, adding hundreds of new Hammerheads to its fleet. They also implemented new inexpungible class command ships, 3-kilometer-long warships that were themselves intended to sell more Hammerheads, as each command ship could coordinate up to 64 of the smaller cruisers. This cemented the Hammerhead's place as the backbone of the Republic Navy, and all of the smaller ships used by the Republic during that time were variants based on its design. Unfortunately for the Republic, few of those warships were suitable for the type of war the Republic attempted to wage against the Mandalorians. Republic Navy commanders attempted to use their swarms of Hammerheads for overwhelming force attacks, which typically failed against the Mandalorians and their heavier weaponry. Thousands of Hammerheads were destroyed due to poor usage in the Mandalorian Wars, and it wasn't until Revan and Malak took charge and new warships came into play that the Mandalorian Wars turned in the Republic's favor. During the last years of the Mandalorian Wars, as Revan and Malak began their counteroffensive, 2 new vessels entered use in the Republic Navy: the Interdictor-class cruiser, which was twice as large as the Hammerhead and was capable of ripping ships out of hyperspace, and the Centurion-class battlecruiser, which replaced the Inexpungible class as the Republic's primary command vessel. These 2 ships came to make up the bulk of Revan's fleet, and Hammerheads fell into support roles. Most of this fleet was destroyed during the Battle of Malachor V, but due to the tremendous successes of these vessels, especially the Interdictors, the Republic began mass-producing them after the end of the Mandalorian Wars, planning to replace the Hammerheads with their larger cousins. But these plans were dashed when Revan and Malak returned to Republic space as self-declared Dark Lords of a new Sith Empire, sparking the Jedi Civil War. Their first attack was against the Republic shipyards on Forost, where most of the new Interdictors were being produced. Exploiting the element of surprise and the loyalty much of the Republic Navy still owed them, Revan and Malak practically stole the whole fleet, and so the Interdictor became their primary warship during the Jedi Civil War. In desperation, the Republic Navy once more took the Hammerhead-class cruiser as its primary warship class, and this time they altered their tactics to account for the vessel's capabilities. Instead of trying to match Revan's tactics or default to the tactics used earlier in the Mandalorian Wars, the Republic divided its navy into small fleets of Hammerheads and smaller 4A-class blockade runners, using the advantages of their smaller cruisers against the Sith. One of the biggest assets of the Hammerhead-class cruiser was its maneuverability, speed, and durability, and only through exploiting these factors was the Republic able to survive the onslaught that was the Jedi Civil War. While Revan used his cruisers more as battleships, the Republic Navy started sending out small groups of Hammerheads to perform hit-and-run attacks, disorienting Sith fleets enough for larger Republic battle groups and Bastila Shan's battle meditation to finish them off. During the Jedi Civil War and the Dark Wars that followed, the Hammerhead-class cruiser was indispensable in ensuring the continued survival of the Republic. Their speed and maneuverability made them surprisingly effective against Sith interdictors, and large fleets of them using evasive tactics could successfully outmaneuver and blast their way through forces of much larger warships. Their cheapness meant that the Republic could produce large numbers of them without further crushing its economy. This made them an instrumental part of the eventual Republic victory in the Dark Wars as well. Indeed, without Hammerheads patrolling the space lanes following the end of the Jedi Civil War, the Republic might have collapsed from internal turmoil even without the Sith. In a sense, the Hammerhead could be seen as the Republic's answer to the stateless strategy, a classic dilemma that pretty much all of the Republic's enemies exploited over the course of its long history. That dilemma was simple. It was impossible to control all of space, which meant it was pretty much impossible for a faction that didn't have core territory in need of protection to be wiped out, as fleets could just hide in the middle of nowhere until it was time to strike. A centralized state under attack from such a faction had a choice of evils. They could attempt to comb the void while leaving the core territories vulnerable, or they could defend those core territories and allow their enemies to grow stronger. The Republic was obviously never able to take advantage of the stateless strategy, but the Hammerhead-class cruiser allowed it to do the next best thing. Small fleets of the vessels were able to operate statelessly against invading Sith forces, simultaneously defending the Republic's core territories while also being impossible for the Sith to pin down and destroy. By all rights, the Republic should not have survived the Jedi Civil War, and it shouldn't have survived the Dark Wars either. But it survived both of them, in no small part due to these formidable warships. They saved the Republic again and again, ultimately breaking the back of the Sith Empire at Rakata Prime and finishing off its remnants at Telos 4. Following the end of the Dark Wars, the Hammerhead influenced Republic naval shipbuilding for millennia to come. Though the Republic did go back to building larger warships as well, it made good use of smaller cruisers and frigates for the rest of the old Sith Wars and even during the new Sith Wars. During the Republic Golden Age, 3,000 years later, the Hammerhead-class cruiser was still a major influence over the types of ships used by the Republic judicial forces. Only in the lead up to the Clone Wars was the lesson of the Hammerheads forgotten somewhat, as the ships commissioned for the new Republic Navy were almost all descendants of the Interdictor class and the Centurion class, the vessels the Republic used in the Mandalorian Wars. These tactics were brought back into use by the Rebel Alliance, however, which, like the old Republic, was forced to rely on smaller ships, and it continued to prefer such vessels even when it became the New Republic. As for the Hammerhead itself, it remained in service long after the Dark Wars. Alongside other, similar vessels, they were still the backbone of the Republic Navy 300 years later, during the Great Galactic War and several subsequent conflicts, which marked the end of the old Sith Wars. Larger capital ships, like the Invincible-class Dreadnought heavy cruiser, came into play over the course of the centuries that followed, but when the new Sith Wars broke out in 2000 BBY, these 2,000-year-old vessels once more took the lead, albeit with plenty of retrofitting. They remained the mainstay of the Republic Navy through the entirety of that millennium-long conflict, as they were optimal for countering the disorganized hit-and-fade tactics of the new Sith. Only after the end of the new Sith Wars was the Hammerhead retired, 3,000 years after its debut, along with the rest of the Republic Navy. Even then, some continued to serve in the planetary security forces of poorer sectors even up to the time of the Clone Wars, making this a truly long-lived warship. For comparison, the Venator-class Star Destroyer only lasted 8 years as a mainline warship, which is 0.003% of the mainline lifespan of the Hammerhead. The Republic's ATTE Walker was the backbone of the Grand Army of the Republic, especially during the opening half of the Clone Wars. It was a workhorse, a perfectly armored vehicle for use in just about any campaign. It was an essential component in Republic battle plans, and few battles, especially in the first half of the war, occurred without the use of these versatile war machines. Without them, the Clone Wars may well have been lost. The ATTE wasn't the Republic's only ground vehicle by a long shot, not even at the start of the war. From the beginning, the Republic also had Nimbal TX-120 fighter tanks, AT-XT medium walkers, speeder bikes, SP-HAT heavy artillery, and after a few months, AT-RT scout walkers. Each of these filled a specific role, all of which very much needed filling and weren't of much use outside of them. The ATTE, however, was in a class of its own. The ATTE could be used for an incredibly diverse range of tasks, encompassing several archetypal roles at once and performing surprisingly well in all of them. The usefulness of this speaks for itself. After all, throughout the entire war, the ATT never saw major changes and remained in service more or less as it had entered it, and was only retired a few years into the reign of the Empire. Even as the Republic developed newer, seemingly more useful war machines like the Juggernaut, AT-AP, and UT-AT, the ATTE remained in service. To understand why, let's take a more in-depth look at the ATTE. The all-terrain tactical enforcer was a large, heavily armed and armored combat walker, one of the first of the infamous AT line. Developed by Rothana Heavy Engineering, a subsidiary of Kuat Drive Yards, the ATTE was designed based on a heavily armored creature native to the frozen peaks of Rothana, which had ultimately surpassed greatly in terms of formidability. It was intended as an all-purpose heavy walker, and the completed design ended up featuring 6 well-spread legs for stability, 2 heavily armored compartments for troops, 7 different heavy weapons, and very few weak spots. The first advantage of the walker was, well, that it was a walker. Its 6 legs were well spread, affording it plenty of stability. Unlike with wheels, these legs allowed the ATTE stability on uneven terrain, and unlike with repulsor lifts, they allowed the walkers to stroll right through energy shields. They even doubled as weapons, and the drivers of ATTEs were known to trample targets that came within range. These legs also had weaknesses, most notably mines and unstable terrain, but mines were rarely used by the Confederacy, and the latter problem ultimately resulted in the development of the UT-AT. The ATTE was crewed by a team of 7 clones, each of which operated a limited range of functions, which meant that the walkers were hard to fully disable or take over. The forward cockpit of each walker housed the driver and the spotter, with the former serving only to move the war machine, and the latter acting as the tank commander, tasked with coordinating the rest of the team. The 5 other clones were all gunners, and they were spread throughout the walker to make its weaponry harder to disable. One was stationed in each corner of the interior, and the final gunner was stationed in an exposed turret at the top of the ATTE. The ATTE also had 2 moderately spacious interior compartments, which could each hold 10 clone troopers for deployment. Both compartments in the standard configuration were identical, having seats for troops, 2 boarding ramps, racks for DC-15 rifles, 2 gunnery stations, an emergency hatch in the roof, and a tunnel through the center section of the walker connecting them. The front compartment had the additional responsibility of manually reloading the main mass driver cannon, while the rear compartment was modular and could be replaced with a small command center or storage for speeders or AT-RTs. The latter modification offered walkers an even wider range of flexibility, as ATTEs could act as motherships of sort, while scout vehicles ran ahead to fill their own roles. One of the greatest strengths of the ATTE was its heavy armor, which few enemy vehicles could penetrate. The main compartments were sheathed in unusually heavy Durasteel armor, capable of taking many shots from heavy laser cannons and remaining unbreached. Other sections were less well armored, like the central section, the cockpit, and the underbelly, with the latter 2 in particular being infamous weak spots. But these spots were very difficult to hit, and considering the ATTE's weaponry, enemies had a small chance of surviving long enough to line up a shot on them. The ATTE was armed with 6 laser cannons and a mass driver cannon, which was considered overkill for an armored vehicle of its size at the time. The laser cannons were mounted in ball turrets, 4 of which surrounded the walker's cockpit and 2 of which guarded its rear. Between them all, the ATTE had few blind spots, making flanking tactics hard to pull off successfully. While these lasers were secondary weapons, they were quite powerful, being able to quickly gun down swaths of enemy infantry and destroy light vehicles in one shot. The main weapon of the ATTE was the mass driver cannon, which was mounted in a turret at the top of the walker, giving it a 360-degree range. Though slow to fire, the mass driver had an incredible range and was exceptionally powerful. It fired high-power shells encased in energy sheaths which could pierce light shielding and pulverize nearly anything. Of all the vehicles in the Separatist arsenal, only the Geonosian super tank could stand up to the ATT mass driver fire for long, and the cannons were even capable of doing some severe damage to full-sized heavy cruisers in the right circumstances. The final advantage of the ATTE was its versatility. It could perform well in nearly every surface-based environment and even had its uses in space. It could serve as a warship-to-warship boarding craft, it could scale cliffs, and it could even be deployed on asteroids to fire on warships, as Anakin Skywalker displayed on a variety of occasions. There were few environments where the Confederacy was safe from the heavy guns of the ATTE walkers. The ATTE was much more versatile than any other vehicle in the Republic's arsenal, especially at the start of the war. Most Republic vehicles fit firmly into the category of light vehicle or heavy vehicle and had distinct limitations that they shared with the rest of the category. For example, light vehicles like the AT-RT, AT-XD and fighter tank all had their advantages, but none of them could take all that much punishment. On the flip side, large vehicles like the Juggernaut were more heavily armored, but they were difficult to maneuver and there were many environments in which they could not be used. The ATT is actually close to the center in this department. It's fast enough and can be used nearly anywhere, like light vehicles, but with the armor and weaponry of heavy vehicles. This is why the Republic found it so universally useful. The ATTE effectively saved the Republic in the early stages of the Clone Wars, primarily because the Separatists didn't really have any counters to it. They had vehicles that could destroy AT-ATs like Hailfire droids and homing spider droids, but the ATTE could take out either vehicle with one mass driver's shell, and none of the other Separatist vehicles stood a chance against the Walker one-on-one, not even the versatile armored assault tank. All of these advantages were what made the ATTE so utterly essential for the Republic. The Republic, at the start of the Clone Wars, had a numbers disadvantage and material shortages, as its industrial complex was bogged down by a mess of bureaucracy and corporate inefficiency. The ATTE helped alleviate this problem by being able to serve in many roles at once, which meant that Rothana could focus on churning out more of them instead of wasting materials on a larger variety of vehicle types, which is what the Confederacy did. The ATTE wasn't perfect, but it was universally effective enough to hold the line, so to speak, until the Republic got its industries in full gear. Without the ATTE, the Republic may well have been screwed. If they had tried to do what the Separatists did and put out a wider variety of vehicles, then they would have been mauled in several crucial battles, as Republic material shortages meant that there would be fewer vehicles for each role, and no vehicle that would have been able to serve more than a few roles at once. The Confederacy's numbers advantage would have been the deciding factor in vehicle-heavy battles as a result, especially since their war machines were better tested and their strengths and weaknesses were well known. As it is, the Republic barely held back the tide of the Confederacy in the first half of the war, and if this crucial piece of that effort was removed, it wouldn't have done nearly as well. All of this begs one question though. If the ATTE was so useful, then why did the Empire retire it? That is, after all, what happened. The ATTE remained in full service only until the end of the reconquest of the Rim, the Empire's war on the Separatist holdouts that lasted for 2 years after the end of the Clone Wars. After that, those ATTEs that weren't retired outright were stuck in support roles on backwater planets in the Outer Rim, at most serving as backup for the Imperial Juggernauts and newer Walker models. This was because, to put it simply, the Empire was fighting a different war. The ATTE was a machine of the Clone Wars, where large-scale ground battles, massive armies, and heavy vehicles were the norm. After the Separatist holdouts were disposed of, the battles the Empire fought became against smaller, faster rebel cells, who fought in a very different way. They were able to more easily exploit the weaknesses of the ATTE due to how their armies worked, and for the same reason the ATTE was much less effective against them. Furthermore, the roles in which the ATTE continued to be useful were filled by a different war machine, the AT-AT, which was more powerful and more useful for fighting the Galactic Civil War. So that's the story of the ATTE of sorts, and why it was so essential to the Republic war effort during the Clone Wars. Kuat Drive Yard's all-terrain Walker series was a staple of the Republic military during the Clone Wars. The AT line was famous for its large heavy walkers such as the AT-TE, AT-HE, AT-PT and AT-AT. But there were also smaller AT series walkers that were used by the Republic, and one of them put in far more work than any other war machine in the Grand Army of the Republic. We're talking, of course, about the All-Terrain Recon Transport, or ATRT. In this video, we'll be giving you a ride in this highly effective vehicle. 10 years before the outbreak of the Clone Wars, the Kaminoans made a secret contract with Kuat Drive Yards, one of the foremost shipbuilders in the Corps. This contract commissioned a whole host of warships and walkers for the fledgling Grand Army of the Republic, all new designs that were to be constructed in absolute secrecy. Due to this, KDY subcontracted much of the work out to Rathana Heavy Engineering, a Kuat subsidiary based on icy Rathana, an extremely remote and little-known rimworld. RHE was responsible for designing most of the GAR's walkers, most notably the iconic AT-TE. We don't know if the ATRT was also a Rathana product, as most sources simply state it was produced by Kuat, but all things considered, that was probably the case. The ATRT was likely designed either alongside or shortly after the AT-TE, as it was a fixture in Republic armies very early in the Clone Wars. It was extremely stripped down compared to most AT walkers, consisting of little more than a pair of legs, a saddle, and a blaster cannon. However, the ATRT was much more complicated than you might think. Its spindly legs were astoundingly flexible, capable of movement that appeared practically identical to that of a humanoid droid or living being. The ATRT was jaw-droppingly agile. It wasn't only capable of running, but also flanking, dodging, and even jumping. It moved like no other walker. Gyroscopics were probably necessary for this, but that's just speculation. The ATRT's driver sat in a saddle atop the vehicle's reactor and rode the walker using a set of pedals, a set of handlebars, and a small computer display. As a scout walker, the ATRT had a pretty impressive set of sensors with terrain scanners built into its front armor and communications antenna behind the driver. 2 detachable cargo compartments on either side of the walker's reactor could contain up to 20 kilograms of supplies, including the driver's rifle and consumables for up to a day. The ATRT wasn't all that heavily armed or armored, relying on larger units for backup and combat against anything heavier than light tanks. Most of the walker's armor was located on its fronts, protecting the driver somewhat. For the most part though, the driver was exposed and needed to take care to avoid enemy fire. The ATRT was armed with a nose-mounted repeating blaster cannon and sometimes also with a small mortar launcher. These weapons were meant for anti-infantry use, a job for which they were well suited, but a small group of ATRTs were also capable of bringing down tanks and other large separatist vehicles. ATRTs typically operated in small packs, which theoretically were deployed from grounded Acclamator-class assault ships or Venator-class star destroyers. In practice, however, they were almost always deployed long before the troop ships landed, usually from LAAT gunships, which could carry one in the rear compartment and one in the main hold if the hold was otherwise empty. One variant of the AT-TE could even carry a pair of ATRTs in its rear compartment, which could be deployed via a lift that descended from the bottom of the walker. In both cases, ATRTs were carried into battle already mounted, making them optimal for rapid deployment. With a few exceptions, clones had to receive special training to ride ATRTs. The walkers were quite difficult to manage for the uninitiated. They didn't handle like any other vehicle out there. Before they could ride ATRTs, clones had to first learn to ride organic mounts, which prepared them quite well for the unusual handling of these war machines. Most ATRT riders were ARF troopers who used them as scout walkers, but there were also dedicated ATRT drivers who wore a slightly different armor configuration. For the most part, ATRTs were used as their names suggest, as reconnaissance transports. They were extremely effective in this capacity, able to cover lots of ground quickly and transmit anything their sensors picked up back to command. They were ideal for quick getaways, which Republic scouts often required. Even if ATRT scouts didn't make it back to base, however, ATRTs could still prove quite useful to their commanding officers. Their computers and scanner arrays were designed to transmit every little input they received to the nearest forward command center, keeping the Jedi generals apprised of conditions on the battlefront at all times. AT-RTs were also quite good at a vast spread of other military roles. They could pretty much do everything speeder bikes could do while affording slightly better protection and firepower to their riders. Such roles included, but were not limited to, pursuit, aggressive reconnaissance, and flanking attacks on enemy lines. Some clone units also used AT-RTs as straight-up mechanized cavalry, riding them head-on into battle against the droid army. Even though the AT-RT was somewhat lacking for armor, it was agile enough that it was surprisingly effective at charging into the fray and shooting up the enemy. This wasn't the best approach in larger battles, but against columns of tanks or light infantry battalions, it could prove extremely effective. One clone unit, Lightning Squadron, was particularly fond of this strategy. They lived up to their name at Herdessa, Munilance, Dalang, and Ryloth, striking as fast as lightning. Aside from Lightning Squadron and the rest of the 91st Reconnaissance Corps, quite a few GAR units favoured the AT-RT. Among them were the 501st Legion and the 41st Elite Corps, which painted the walkers in their unit colours and, in the case of the 501st, used them more than any other ground vehicle. The near ubiquity of the AT-RT was even more impressive when you consider that it wasn't the only small, two-legged walker deployed by the Republic military. There was also the experimental AT-XT, which eventually developed into the famed AT-ST, as well as the AT-PT, which was basically just the AT-RT but with an enclosed cabin. Early in the Clone Wars, the AT-RT was used somewhat sparingly. Its first known deployment was with Lightning Squadron in the Battle of Herdessa 6 days after Geonosis, and in 22 BBY it also saw action at Munilance, Dalang, and Christosis, playing key roles in each battle. A few months after the Battle of Christosis, the AT-RT had one of its most well-known outings in the Battle of Ryloth. On Ryloth, Mace Windu and the AT-RT riders of Lightning Squadron played a crucial role in storming the planetary capital, Lesu, outmaneuvering separatist AATs on the road to the city and quickly routing droid army after droid army. After Ryloth, the AT-RT became quite common, seeing use in major battles and smaller missions alike. It was the sole military vehicle used by the 501st Legion in the Battle of Umbara, as it was the only one that could maneuver in Umbara's dense jungles. The 501st's AT-RTs struggled a little on Umbara, but they nonetheless proved their worth, providing crucial fire support and taking down Umbaran vehicles far more powerful than themselves. The AT-RT also saw extensive use in the Outer Rim sieges, especially in the Battle of Kashyyyk. After the rise of the Empire, these walkers were steadily phased out in favour of the easier to use AT-PT and AT-ST, but a handful of scout units, among them Lightning Squadron, continued to use the AT-RT. The Empire next to never used them in a combat role, however, instead relegating the vehicles to their original reconnaissance role. Though even if the Empire didn't care for these adaptable vehicles, plenty of other groups did. The Rebel Alliance used AT-RTs fairly extensively during the Galactic Civil War, often modifying the walkers for greater firepower. They were also very popular among police units, which continued to use them even after the fall of the Empire. These fearsome walkers just refused to die. As far as walker designs go, the AT-RT is pretty high up there, though the AT-TE is still cooler in our opinion.
No vehicle or vessel better symbolizes the Clone Wars than the LAAT/I Gunship. These fearsome attack craft served as the backbone of the Grand Army of the Republic from the first Battle of Geonosis to the end of the war, and served quite well. The LAAT-I knit the Republic military together, connecting the Navy with the Army and various Army units with each other, and its versatility meant that there was always a use for it on the battlefield, no matter the environment or tactical scenario. Without these gunships, the Galactic Republic may well have lost the war, and in this video we're going to be taking a look at why. The Low Altitude Assault Transport Infantry variant was developed by Rothana Heavy Engineering, a subsidiary of Kuat Drive Yards. Rothana had been contracted by the Kaminoans to design new heavy vehicles for the GAR, and together with the AT-TE, the LAAT/I was one of the most well-known models it produced in response. The Kaminoans commissioned thousands of these gunships, intending for them to fill the role of air support. LAAT/I gunships were extremely agile, capable of reaching speeds of up to 620 km per hour in atmosphere without losing the ability to turn on a dime. They were intended for use in planets' lower atmospheres, where they could take advantage of mountains and canyons to take cover from artillery. They were powered by large generators located just behind the cockpit, which fed power to weapon systems, repulsor lifts, and engines through armored conduits. These craft were mainly kept aloft by heavy-duty repulsor lifts. Gunships were mainly supported by large repulsor arrays on their undersides, while additional repulsors on their wingtips and tails controlled roll. LAAT/Is were propelled by a pair of engines, which, together with the craft's fuel tank, were located at the rear of the gunship for safety reasons. These gunships didn't come with onboard shield generators, an unfortunate consequence of the compact nature of the craft, but they were well armored and equipped with physical blast shields to compensate. Republic gunships were operated by a crew of 4, a pilot, a co-pilot, and 2 gunners. The gunners were optional, and manned the 2 ball turrets that some LAAT models featured on either side of the troop hold, while the pilot and co-pilot occupied the craft's twin cockpits. The pilot, who sat in the forward cockpit, was responsible for steering the gunship and managing the troop hold, while the co-pilot operated the gunship's various weapon systems and could take over steering in an emergency. Both the pilot and the co-pilot were in a bit of an awkward position on the craft. Their cockpits were exposed, and they could only access them via crew ladders in the ceiling of the forward hold, which weren't ideal for escape in emergency situations. Fortunately for the pilots, however, Rathana's engineers foresaw this being an issue, and thus the whole cockpit section of the LAAT/I could eject from the craft and serve as an escape pod. The LAAT/I was extremely well armed. The craft featured 3 turreted anti-personnel laser cannons, 2 on the chin and 1 just below the engines, which could absolutely shred even the toughest enemy infantry, allowing these gunships to easily clear out landing zones. They also featured 4 composite beam laser turrets, 1 on each wingtip and 2 positioned in front of the troop hold, which produced high power energy beams with pinpoint accuracy. The 2 that flanked the troop hold could be removed and replaced with armored doors, and were individually manned and operated by clone gunners, who usually used them to target enemy units on the battlefield below. The wingtip turrets were remotely operated and typically employed against far-off hard targets. LAATs featured more than laser cannons, however. They came with more than their fair share of ordnance as well. Their main weapons were a pair of sizable mass driver missile launchers located at the top of the craft, which featured magazines of 30 rockets each. The kinds of rockets LAATs carried varied from mission to mission and could range from short-range homing missiles and anti-personnel frag rounds to high explosive and armor-piercing rounds. Lastly, LAAT/I gunships carried 4 light air-to-air rockets on the underside of each wing. But the LAAT/I wasn't just a weapons platform. Its main function after all was troop transport. They could each carry nearly a full platoon of clone troopers in their main holds, which were protected by the drooping wings and heavily armored doors of the craft. The main hold of the LAAT/I was designed to protect its occupants as much as possible, while also allowing them to provide covering fire for ground troops from the air, and featured inertial compensators that allowed clones to stand while the craft was in flight. Additionally, a rack in the rear of the main hold allowed these gunships to also carry 4 speeder bikes, which could be deployed through a rear hatch. The gunship's forward compartment, which was located in its armored nose, could be atmospherically sealed and contained ammunition stores, backup equipment, medical supplies, and IM-6 medical droids. All told, the LAAT/I gunship was an incredibly useful piece of equipment. It could rapidly and safely deploy a large number of clones onto the battlefield at once, especially when used in large numbers. For example, the 66 LAAT/Is carried aboard an Acclamator-class assault ship could deploy nearly 2,000 clones in a single wave. Additionally, they could serve as highly versatile and tremendously destructive aircraft in their own right, with each gunship carrying enough weaponry to lay waste to half a battlefield. The Republic couldn't possibly have asked for a better craft, and the LAAT/I remained popular for the entire length of the Clone Wars for good reason. But that's not all there is to say about the LAAT/I. They weren't just a godsend to the Republic because of what they were capable of, their role in the wider Grand Army of the Republic was also a huge asset. You see, when the Kaminoans yielded control of the GAR to the Republic, they also handed over the standardized battle strategies they had used to train the clones. Republic tactics in the early stages of the Clone Wars relied heavily on the blueprint the Kaminoans had made for ground assault, as they were still scrambling to assemble a competent military high command at the time. The Republic only survived the Confederacy's opening campaigns because this tactical blueprint actually worked pretty well, in no small part due to the LAAT/I. The Kaminoans built their standard plan around 5 assets that they knew the GAR would have in good supply: clone troopers, ATTEs, SPAHATs, LAATs, and Acclamators. As the plan went, the assault ships would begin the ground assault, bombarding targets from the air and disgorging swarms of LAATs. The gunships would deploy about 2,000 clones and 14 ATTEs in a massive first wave and then speed back to the assault ships to pick up a second. The first wave would begin clearing out an assembly area where the assault ships could land, continually reinforced and resupplied by the gunships, following which the assault ships would land and deploy everything else en masse. LAAT/Is would then provide air support as the SPHATs and the ATTEs marched to the fore, obliterating everything in their paths. The battle plan relied heavily on LAATs, and when put into practice, the LAATs carried their weight and then some. In the early battles of the Clone Wars, Republic gunships ruled the skies, shooting down anything that challenged their air supremacy and raining death upon Separatist ground forces. They proved to be so reliable at safely transporting troops to the surface that some Jedi generals actually took to using them as aerial command posts, which they could use to get a bird's eye view of the battlefield. LAAT/I gunships also had one last role that made them absolutely essential. They served as mobile comms relays for GAR battle nets. The Republic's clone troopers were trained to fight as a massive collective force, and this relied heavily on communication. The helmets that came with Phase 1 armor were all equipped with state-of-the-art internal communication systems, which received command signals and audio feeds from other clones and sent live video feed of the battle back to the base. The gunships actually played a vital role in this process. They picked up on and boosted signals from individual clones, contributing greatly to unit cohesion and connecting frontline troops to command. This allowed the GAR to fight with efficiency and coordination that rivaled the CIS droid armies, which was no small feat since the CIS used central control computers to direct vast armies. Without the LAAT/I, the Republic would have been annihilated by the Confederacy in the first few months of the war. Early victories like the First Battle of Geonosis and the Battle of Moonlist were won in large part due to these gunships. Of course, the Confederacy eventually devised counters to the LAAT/I. Artillery coupled with swarms of starfighters did a great job of clearing the skies of these devastating craft, as the CIS demonstrated in the Second Battle of Geonosis. However, by that point, the Republic had started to rely less on the LAAT/I and more on a diverse array of newer vehicles, which meant this didn't end up being the crippling blow the Confederacy had hoped it would be. The damage was already done. The LAAT/I had successfully blunted the Confederacy's early advantage, and it continued to serve the Republic well for the rest of the war.
The Clone Wars era Republic Navy is usually remembered by fans due to its Venator-class Star Destroyer, an iconic warship that acted as the Navy's backbone. But there was another ship that was just as important as the Venator, the Acclamator-class assault ship, a heavy cruiser that served both as a frontline warship and a troop transport. Jedi generals generally favoured the larger Venator over the Acclamator, but believe it or not, the Acclamator was the better ship by far. In fact, the Acclamator was one of the most overpowered ships of the Clone Wars, and in this video, we're going to explain why. Unlike the Venator-class and Victory-class Star Destroyers, which were products of the mid-war Victor initiative, the Acclamator was commissioned directly by the Kaminoans as part of the Clone Army project. They hired the Kuat Drive Yard subsidiary Rothana Heavy Engineering to design a next-generation warship, a fitting complement for what they believed would be the most powerful army the galaxy had ever seen. Rothana gave the Kaminoans their dream ship, setting design trends that would live on in KDY's infamous Star Destroyer line. Unlike most warships, the Acclamator class wasn't primarily designed for naval combat. Instead, it was designed to spearhead planetary invasions. Its job was to destroy key enemy fortifications from orbit, descend into lower atmosphere to disgorge swarms of gunships carrying the first wave of ground troops, and then land and deploy the rest of the army once the landing zone was clear. In the early days of the Clone Wars, it was mostly used as intended and to great effect. No separatist ship could match the impressive mass deployment capabilities of the Acclamator. As the war went on, however, the Acclamator found itself pressed into other roles as well. During the first few months of the war, before the Venator-class Star Destroyer was deployed, the Acclamator served as the backbone of the rebuilt Republic Navy. This was by necessity. The Acclamator was simply the only warship the Republic had in suitable numbers. But the Acclamator filled this new role well. In early Clone Wars space battles, these assault ships proved a match for the Confederacy's Lucrehulk-class core ships, though they struggled against some of the larger separatist vessels. Later in the Clone Wars, a number of radically different variants of the Acclamator appeared. Before the deployment of the Venator, some Acclamators, like the Navuta B, were modified to act as starfighter carriers, while others, like the Prosecutor, were made into more generalist ships that had a fairly even mix of hangar space, troop capacity, and firepower. Late in the war, the Republic deployed an Acclamator II model which closely resembled the stock model but was intended for extensive orbital bombardment instead of troop deployment. All told, the Acclamator was a very adaptable ship, and this made it invaluable to the Republic Navy, which was struggling to rebuild itself from scratch in the midst of a war after 1,000 years of non-existence. The Acclamator-class assault ship, formerly classified as a heavy cruiser, was 752 meters long, distinct with its wedge-shaped hull, thin aft tail fin, and conning tower-mounted command bridge. The Acclamator was incredibly fast for its size. It was capable of reaching 3,500 Gs in space, and it featured a hyperdrive with a 0.6 rating, which made it one of the fastest ships in hyperspace. To compare, the Venator-class Star Destroyer had a 1.0 hyperspace rating, while the fastest ship ever made, the Millennium Falcon, had a 0.5, just a tenth of a point faster than the Acclamator. This incredibly powerful hyperdrive allowed the Acclamator to rapidly deploy troops on new battlefronts all over the galaxy. The Acclamator was a tough little ship, with neutronium-impregnated armor and powerful deflector shields. While it wasn't as heavily armored as some larger warships, it could take a beating before systems started to fail, and unlike the Venator, it didn't have any major weak spots. As far as weapons went, the Acclamator was a beast, with 12 quad turbo lasers, 24-point defense guns, and 4 heavy torpedo tubes bearing dozens of torpedoes each. That might not sound like much, but it was more anti-capital firepower than the Venator had, and with a better spread across the ship's hull. Those turbo lasers were located along the broadsides on both the dorsal and ventral surfaces, while the torpedo tubes were forward-facing and the point defense guns lined the edge of the entire ship. Additionally, sourcebooks state that those turbo lasers were rated at 200 gigatons per shot. This is absolutely absurd because that's the equivalent of 2,000 thermonuclear bombs. But it's safe to say that at the very least, those guns were really powerful. And we have yet to mention the torpedo tubes, which were the Acclamator's primary weapons and could crack open unshielded core ships with ease. The biggest selling points of the Acclamator, however, were its crew and complement. The Acclamator only required a crew of 700, which was absolutely nothing for a ship of its size. The Venator required a crew 10 times that size, while many smaller ships needed crews of at least 1,000. Considering the vast disparity relative to the Venator, it's possible the figure of 700 didn't include the engineers responsible for the assault ship's vast vehicle complement, but that's just a supposition on our part. Speaking of the Acclamator's complements, no ship in the Republic Navy came close to matching it. A single Acclamator could carry 16,000 clone troopers, the equivalent of almost 2 full 501st Legions. On top of a truly insane troop capacity, the Acclamator could carry 320 speeder bikes, 66 LAAT gunships, 14 LAAT carriers, 48 ATTEs, 36 SPHATs, and 11,250 tons of cargo. Just one Acclamator stocked to capacity could conquer your average colony world. All told, the Acclamator was extremely powerful. It was fast, it was tough, it had the firepower for both orbital bombardment and ship-to-ship combat, it could carry a whole army, it only required a tiny crew, and it was relatively cheap as far as warships went. A small fleet of these bad boys could conquer virtually any planet in the galaxy. The ships had the speed to get there before the enemy, the firepower to ruin any ships that got in their way, and the troop capacity to overwhelm any defending force. It wasn't a perfect design, of course, but all of its flaws could be solved by either deploying more Acclamators or deploying Acclamators of a different variety. Consider, for example, the Acclamator's total lack of starfighters. The stock model had no starfighter-capable hangars, and while it could deploy LAAT gunships in that role if necessary, there were variants that did carry starfighters. One variant had starfighter hangars in place of the vehicle hold, allowing the ship to carry 200 V-19 Torrents into battle, while another featured 8 starfighter-capable hangars built along its sides. These had a smaller capacity than the previous variant, but preserved the Acclamator's vehicle base. These variants were rare due to the development of the Venator, but it's worth noting that 2 carrier Acclamators could almost match a Venator's fighter capacity, while requiring less than 20% of a Venator's crew between them. We mentioned earlier that, though tough, a single Acclamator would struggle against a larger capital ship. However, this problem has a simple solution: bring in more Acclamators. For the price of 5 Venator-class Star Destroyers and the crew of just 1, you could get 10 Acclamators, which together would boast over 100 of those mega powerful turbo lasers, 1,000 core ship cracking missiles to lob around, and 160,000 clone troopers to deploy. The numbers get really crazy when you look at certain Venator heavy Clone Wars battles and work out how many Acclamators they could have manned with their crews. Remember the Battle of Ryloth, where the Republic struggled to punch through the Separatist blockade with 3 Star Destroyers? If the crews of those vessels were distributed across Acclamator-class assault ships, Anakin could have rolled up to that battle with 30 Acclamators and dunked on the blockade so hard that Wat Tambor probably would have surrendered on the spot. So, there you have it. The Acclamator-class assault ship was absurdly good, a beast of a warship that deserves more attention than it gets. Star Destroyers are one of the most iconic classes of starship in Star Wars. For most fans, the name conjures up images of the most infamous Star Destroyers, the Imperial 1 and Imperial 2 classes. Fans of Star Wars The Clone Wars are also familiar with the older Venator-class Star Destroyer, a Republic Navy design. But all of these famous warship classes can trace their design lineage back to a much less well-known ship, the Victory-class Star Destroyer. Like the Venator, the Victory was a Clone Wars era Star Destroyer, a groundbreaking innovation that forever transformed naval combat. In this video, we'll be telling the story of this forgotten ship. Early in the Clone Wars, in the wake of the Acclamator-class assault ship's success, Kuat Drive Yards and Rendili Star Drive collaborated on the Victor Initiative project, which sought to design a large, powerful, next-generation flagship for the Republic Navy. Designed by the shipwrights Wallex and Lyra Blissex, the new vessels would be classified by Kuat Drive Yards and Anaxis War College as Star Destroyers, heavily armed warships about a kilometer long. The flagship project of the Victor Initiative was the Victory-class Star Destroyer, designed by Wallex Blissex, and the first of the Star Destroyer designs. However, the second design, Lyra Blissex Venator-class Star Destroyer, was rushed into production first, as the Republic needed its new warships fast and the design for the Victory class was still being tweaked. Starting at the end of 22 BBY, the Venator-class entered production at Kuwait drive yards and quickly became the backbone of the Republic Navy. Rendili Star Drive, which didn't have a stake in the Venator-class, wasn't very happy about the newer design being premiered first, but it continued to collaborate with KDY on the Victory-class anyway. For about a year and a half, the Venator-class was the only Star Destroyer in production, making it the most common command ship in the Republic Navy. This was despite the fact that it was more designed for a support role. The Venator functioned primarily as a carrier and was probably intended to support the Victory-class, which was far more suited to the role of a mainline battleship. However, as the Victory-class continued to endure development hell, the Venator-class took over both roles with a moderate degree of success. In 20 BBY, new developments in the war forced a paradigm shift. That year, Separatist Admiral Juaningo broke the Republic's blockade of the Foro shipyards with the new fleet of densely armoured Bulwark-class battlecruisers. These ships were so heavily armoured that they could ram lesser vehicles with impunity. They were also heavily armed. As such, Ningo decided to take his Bulwark fleet on a joyride across Sector 0, the very heart of the Republic. Desperate to stop the Bulwark fleet, the Republic ordered KDY and Rendili to rush the Victory-class into production. The first ships of this class were assembled into the Victory fleet, which was led by commanders Jan Dodona and Terranald Screed. They chased the Bulwark fleet all over the sector, repeatedly battling Ningo to a draw before finally vaporizing the Admiral and his fleet above Anaxis. Dodona and Screed became heroes, and the news of their victory spread like wildfire. More Victory-class Star Destroyers were immediately commissioned, and before long, they became a popular Republic Navy flagship. Visually, the Victory-class Star Destroyer bore a strong resemblance to the later Imperial-class Star Destroyer, though at 900 meters, the Victory was a little over half of the size. Like the Imperial-class, this wedge-shaped warship featured a cluster of 3 main drive engines, 2 hangar bays, a reactor bulb on its ventral side, and a distinctive hammer-shaped conning tower that housed command bridge and twin shield generators. However, the Victory-class had a number of notable external differences from its successor. The most obvious differences were 2 pairs of large, protruding armoured flaps on either side of the ship's aft section, which could fan out to reveal the warship's missile tubes. The bridge stalk also featured a pair of thin towers that protruded noticeably from the main structure, a top-mounted comms array, and a forward-mounted observation station. At full strength, a Victory-class Star Destroyer supported 4,798 crew members, though it could operate on a crew of 1,785. This was considerably smaller than the crew of the Venator-class Star Destroyer, a vessel which was only slightly larger. The Victory-class could also carry 2,040 troops into battle, which was roughly equal to the Venator's troop capacity. Unlike the Venator, however, the Victory-class was designed to coordinate planetary operations, so it was generally preferred as a troop carrier. While the Venator was infamous for its mediocre armoring, especially around the long dorsal hangar strip, the Victory was built like a tank with fewer vulnerable hangars and far fewer weak points in its armor. It also had better shields, owing to the advanced shield projectors mounted atop the bridge stalk. The Victory could carry but a few dozen starfighters, plus a handful of shuttles and groundcraft, while the Venator could carry over 400 fighters. These disparities make sense when you consider the roles these 2 Star Destroyers were originally supposed to fill. The Victory was meant to be a mainline battleship, while the Venator was meant to be a carrier. As a battleship first and foremost, the Victory-class Star Destroyer was heavily armed, much more so than the Venator. Apart from its 10 tractor beam projectors, the Victory-class featured a total of 50 turbo-laser turrets, 5 times the number sported by the Venator. 10 of these were powerful quad turbo lasers mounted along the Star Destroyer's broadsides, while the remaining 40 were dual turbo lasers, with 30 mounted along the broadsides and 10 forward batteries. Additionally, the Victory-class featured 2 massive arrays of concussion missile tubes, totaling 80, all of which were protected by the broadside armor flaps. Curiously, the Victory doesn't seem to have had any point defense turrets, but this may just have been a sourcebook oversight. As you can probably tell, the Victory-class excelled in ship-to-ship combat. It could shrug off plenty of damage and dish out far more in return. Its many turbo lasers, which covered both broadside and forearcs, could rapidly tear through Separatist cruisers, while its torpedo launchers could unleash a frightening amount of damage, enough to bring down even Lucrehulk-class battleships. With that said, the Victory-class wasn't without its flaws. The initial run of these Star Destroyers was slow and had subpar maneuverability, a shortcoming that the Victor Initiative didn't have time to correct before the Victory was rushed into production. Late in the Clone Wars, KDY and Rendili put out the Victory 2 class Star Destroyer, which was tweaked a little to correct some of its flaws. The Victory 2 had much more powerful engines, eliminating the speed issue, and they had also swapped out the Victory 1's concussion missiles for more turbo lasers and 10 heavy ion cannons. By the time of the Battle of Coruscant, both Victory-class variants were in use, though the Victory 1 was much more numerous. Due to its late premiere, the Victory-class never really surpassed the Venator-class as the main Star Destroyer in the Republic Navy. After the Victory's launch, the ships usually served as the flagships of flotillas composed mostly of the Venator-class. Additionally, many Jedi generals continued to use Venator-class vessels as their flagships despite the advantages of the Victory-class, limiting the spread of the newer, tougher Star Destroyers. It was only after the end of the Clone Wars, when the Jedi were purged from military command and the Republic had transformed into the Empire, that the Victory-class finally surpassed the Venator in popularity. Of course, by that point, both Star Destroyer designs had competitors. Late in the Clone Wars, Lyra Blissex put out 2 new Star Destroyer designs based heavily on the Victory-class. In the final days of the war, beginning at the Battle of Coruscant, the first of these new ships entered service and rapidly supplanted the older Star Destroyers. These were the Imperator-class and Tector-class Star Destroyers, each twice as long as the Victory and far more powerful. After Imperialization, the Imperator-class became the Imperial-class and the new backbone of the Imperial Navy. However, the Victory-class remained in service. It was widely considered second only to the Imperial-class, and it was about as common as the larger vessels for most of the Dark Time. The Victory usually served in planetary defense roles, but it was frequently used in larger battles during the Galactic Civil War, often to great effect. They supported Imperial-class vessels very effectively, especially the Victory 1 and its concussion missile troops. While the Victory developed a reputation as antiquated, it continued to see plenty of action even after the Battle of Endor. After the remnants of the Empire came under the command of Grand Admiral Thrawn, the Victory-class saw a new boom in popularity due to a shortage of larger warships. In our opinion, the Victory-class was probably the coolest Star Destroyer, but what do you think? Do you agree? If you were a warship captain, would you prefer the Victory or the Venator? Let us know all your thoughts and more in the comments section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.